The first thing Harry noticed about the leaky cauldron was that no one looked at him the way he was used to being looked at. At home, if Privet Drive counted as home, which he had decided this morning it probably didn't, people looked at him with the practiced disinterest of people who had made a choice. At the leaky cauldron, the looks were different. Wide and wondering and a little frightened, and every person who caught sight of his scar seemed to need to do something about it, shake his hand or touch his arm, or say his name in that particular awed and careful way, the syllables stretched thin. Harry Potter. As if the name were something fragile, as if saying it required permission. He hadn't known what to do with any of it. He shook the hands offered to him, nodded at the names he was given, names he wouldn't remember in 10 minutes, and tried not to look as bewildered as he felt. Hagrid had steered him through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who didn't need the room to move, because the room moved itself out of the way. They stepped out into Diagon Alley, and the world, briefly, rearranged itself. He didn't have a word for it. The street was packed and cobbled and alive in a way that no street he'd ever walked down had been, full of shops that made impossible things seem practical. Cauldrons stacked in a window, cages of owls in another, a woman disappearing into a doorway with a length of purple silk over her arm. The air smelled different here, not like London at all. It smelled like something burning, cleanly, and something sweet underneath, and something Harry had no name for that he associated already with the idea of belonging somewhere. He kept up with Hagrid's enormous stride and tried to be somewhere in his own head that was calmer than the rest of him. There was a vault. His parents had left him a vault. He had never owned anything in his life that couldn't fit in a sock under a loose floorboard. And now apparently he owned a vault full of gold that had been sitting under London since the night he was 15 months old. The bank was visible above the crowd now. White marble, brilliant and quiet, unlike everything else in this street. Gringotts. Inside, the noise of Diagon Alley dropped away and replaced itself with something different. The systematic quiet of people at serious work. The hall was enormous and white, and the counter running its length was occupied by goblins, small and very still when focused, very quick when they moved, with long, clever fingers and faces that gave nothing away. Harry watched them and felt something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite comfort, more like being seen accurately for once. These were not people who would shake his hand and say his name and look at his scar. They were people who would run a transaction. Hagrid was already steering him toward a free teller, reaching into the moleskin coat with its endless pockets. Harry watched Hagrid's hand emerge, a key. Small and golden, pinched between Hagrid's enormous fingers, plain-looking. The teeth worked finely. The loop at the top twisted in some design Harry couldn't quite make out. Ordinary, except that it wasn't ordinary at all. It was the key to his vault. His parents' vault, the vault that had been sitting untouched under London since the autumn of 1981. They had died when he was 15 months old. That was 10 years, almost to the day. Something in Harry went very still. Who has been keeping that? His voice came out quieter than he'd expected. Hagrid turned the key still pinched in his enormous hand. Eh? Harry looked at the key, then at the goblin teller who had paused over the open ledger with the flat, appraising expression of someone reassessing the scope of a transaction. "The key?" Harry said. "My parents died in 1981. Someone has been holding it since then. Who was it?" A pause. Hagrid opened his mouth and then seemed to find no words, waiting. The goblin teller looked at Harry for a moment longer than felt neutral. "You are the account holder," it said. "Yes, account holders may inquire as to the custody history of their keys." It wasn't said warmly. It wasn't said dismissively either. It was said the way a rule was stated, because it was the rule, and the rule existed. "I'd like to," Harry said. The ledger that was consulted was not the one open on the counter, but a second one, retrieved from below with the silent efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of question. Harry watched the pages turn, close-written pages covered in script he couldn't read, and tried to keep his breathing even. He was good at that. He had spent 10 years at the Dursleys, learning to be good at that. The goblin teller looked up. The key to this vault was registered under the custody of one Albus Dumbledore on the 3rd day of November in the year 1981. Key custody was transferred to Rubeus Hagrid for transport on the 31st day of July 1991. Harry was aware of the silence beside him, where Hagrid's big voice usually was. Was there anyone before that, before Dumbledore? The goblin's expression did not change. At the time of Mr. Dumbledore's registration, this account carried a secondary trustee designate. That designate had been entered by the original account holder prior to his death. A pause of exactly one breath. That designation was superseded upon Mr. Dumbledore's registration. "What name?" Harry said. "Sirius Orion, Black. And Harry turned the name over in his mind, the way you turned a stone over that you'd found on the road, looking for something underneath it. There was nothing there. He had never heard it before. He was quite certain of this, because his memory was reliable. It was one of the only things the Dursleys hadn't managed to undermine, simply because they'd never known it was there. He looked at Hagrid. Hagrid had gone the color of old plaster. His jaw was moving. Nothing was coming out of it. The vault was extraordinary, and Harry barely saw it. He knew distantly that he was seeing it, the little cart rattling on its track through absolute dark, the stomach left behind drops. And then the chamber itself lit warmly by the goblin's lantern, mounds of gold galleons, columns of silver, sickles, heaps of little bronze cunts, his parents' whole fortune in a room underground untouched for a decade. He loaded his pockets. He chose amounts without thinking about them, because he was still somewhere back at the counter with the name turning slowly over in his mind. Sirius Orion, Black. Who was that? Why had that name made Hagrid look like that? In the cart back up with cold air streaming past and Hagrid enormous and silent beside him, Harry held the vault key in his palm. It was very small. You could lose it in a coat pocket and forget it was there for 10 years. 3 days after his parents died, someone had walked into this bank and put his name on it. Dumbledore. Harry didn't know the man, except as the collection of titles on his Hogwarts letter: Order of Merlin, First Class, Grand Sorcerer, Chief Warlock, Supreme Mugwump, which he'd read so many times over the summer that he could recite the whole list, though he hadn't known what any of it meant. He still didn't know what most of it meant. But Dumbledore had walked into Gringotts 3 days after Harry's parents were killed and registered himself as the keeper of Harry's key, and on the account there had been another name first, a name put there by Harry's father before he died, and that name was now superseded, which was a word Harry understood to mean gone. He didn't know who Sirius Black was. He didn't know why the name had drained the color from Hagrid's face in the space of 2 syllables. He only knew the date, the 3rd of November, 1981, and the hollow feeling of standing on ground he'd assumed was solid, and hearing it shift underneath him. He closed his hand around the key. Hagrid came out of Gringotts, talking about Madame Malkins. He did it the way large people sometimes did uncomfortable things, with great momentum and the implicit suggestion that if you simply kept moving, the thing you'd left behind would lose the will to follow. Robes, he said. Then the bookshop, Then the cauldron shop, you'll need a good pewter one. He ticked them off on his sausage-thick fingers, and each item was another step away from the marble hall and the close-written ledger and the name. Harry stopped walking. Hagrid, the robes first, I think. It's not far, Kegrid. Hagrid stopped. He turned and looked down at Harry with the expression of a man who had hoped, not very seriously, that this might not happen. Who is Sirius Black? The street moved around them without caring. Witches with full shopping baskets, a pair of older boys examining something in the window of the apothecary, a ginger cat washing itself on a windowsill above them. Hagrid stood in the middle of all of it and was very still, the way large things are still when they decide to be. "Never you mind about that," he said. Harry did not move. Hagrid looked at him. Harry had, in 11 years of living at the Dursleys, developed a particular talent for standing in one place and making that stillness felt. It was the stillness of someone who had waited out louder things than this and was fully prepared to wait some more. Hagrid looked away first. He was your dad's friend, he said, and his voice had gone careful in a way that told Harry the word was doing a great deal of work. He's in Azkaban now, Harry. What's Azkaban? The wizard prison. Hagrid shifted his weight. It's not a place people come out of the same. The Dementors guard it. Horrible creatures, they. Well, it's not somewhere you'd want to be. What did he do? Hagrid's beard moved. He was your parents' secret keeper. He said it like he was reciting something, like the shape of the story had been worn smooth by the number of times he'd thought it over. It's a kind of magic. When you're hiding, you choose one person who holds the secret of where you are, and only that person can give it away. Your mum and dad were in hiding because he, who must not be named, was after them. They chose Sirius. A pause. He told him where they were. The street carried on around them after, Hagrid said. When they were. That night, Sirius found another of your dad's friends in the street. And he killed him, and 12 muggles besides. There was an explosion. All they found of Pettigrew was a finger. Harry listened to this carefully. He filed it away. Was Sirius my godfather? Hagrid went very still. Yes. So he was supposed to take care of me. Yes. The word sat between them on the cobblestones, not going anywhere. Hagrid had been crying when he'd come to collect Harry the night before, not then, but he had cried. He'd said so himself, freely and without embarrassment, when he'd described picking Harry up from the ruins of the cottage in Godric's Hollow. He had loved James and Lily Potter the way you loved people when you'd never expected to be loved back by anyone, and they'd included you anyway. And he had believed, still believed. Clearly the belief was sitting right there in the careful way he'd said the words, that the man James had chosen to be Harry's godfather was the reason they were dead. Harry could see the effort it cost him, not to lie, because Hagrid didn't seem to know how to lie, but to hold two things at once. The name on the account, and the man it belonged to. He didn't push further. He had a date, and a name, and a set of facts. He didn't yet know enough to question. He turned and fell into step beside Hagrid's enormous stride. Right, he said, Robes. Hagrid let out a breath that was very nearly a laugh. Madame Malkin's was small and warm, and smelled of sizing and something herbal. Harry stood on a footstool, in his 2 large muggle clothes, while a bustling woman in mauve robes pinned the school uniform around him and chatted about Hogwarts with cheerful confidence, and Harry nodded when it seemed appropriate. The bookshop filled his arms, the cauldron shop filled a bag, the owl emporium was where something shifted. There were tawny owls, and screech owls, and small barn owls that turned their heads with the precise, deliberate care of things that could see in every direction and had chosen to look at you specifically. Harry was examining a cage near the floor when he noticed the one on the high perch, white as fresh snow and entirely composed. She sat with the stillness of something that had decided it was merely a matter of time before the appropriate person presented themselves. And when Harry straightened up and their eyes met, her eyes were amber and they were not incurious. She did not look away. "That one!" Harry said. Hagrid bought her without argument. Carrying her back through the alley, Harry watched her settle and close her eyes with the small, definitive movement of a creature that considered the matter resolved. Hedwig, he decided. It was a name from one of his new school books, and it had the right sound, serious and a little old-fashioned. For a few minutes, walking with a snowy owl in a cage, and his school things under one arm, and the afternoon beginning to thin toward evening, Harry felt something close to ordinary happiness. It was a strange sensation. He wasn't sure he'd felt it before, not quite this version. He didn't entirely trust it. It sat underneath the morning, the way ice sits underneath snow. Ollivander's was dim and smelled of sawdust and something older, something that made the inside of Harry's nose feel like a word at the edge of recall. The wand maker himself was slight and pale with enormous silver eyes that gave the impression of a man for whom the visible world was primarily a surface he was looking through. He moved through the shop with the unhurried certainty of someone who had done this thousands of times and expected to do it thousands more, many wands, each one wrong in its own particular way. Then, a box from somewhere high. "Hollywood," Ollivander said. "Phoenix feather, 11 inches, supple." Harry picked it up, and warmth ran through his fingers like something recognizing itself, and the shop briefly filled with sparks in red and gold, and Ollivander said very softly, "Curious. Yes, curious indeed." He was looking at Harry the way people had been looking at him all day, except that everyone else had been awed, and Ollivander was thinking. "That one's brother," the old man said, more to himself than to Harry, "gave us rather more trouble in the choosing. The phoenix who provided the core gave only one other feather, only ever one other in all these years. That wand has done great things." A pause that was longer than it should have been. Terrible things. One must not forget that. Harry didn't know what to do with that. He wrapped the thought up carefully and set it aside. Next to everything else the day had brought him, the leaky cauldron was quieter in the evening. They had a meal pasties and a pot of tea, and Hagrid ate with the comfortable energy of a man who had walked many miles, and told Harry things about Hogwarts that were warm and certain, and drew pictures in the air, the great hall, the Quidditch pitch, the owlery. Harry listened. He ate the pasty. He nodded at the right moments. When they were nearly finished, Hagrid reached into his coat and set something small and golden on the table between them. "The vault key. Yours now," Hagrid said. "You'll be wanting to keep it safe." Harry picked it up. The light from the leaky cauldron's fire moved across it, finding the fine workmanship of the teeth, the twist of the loop. He turned it over in his hand, feeling its lightness, feeling the simple, solid fact of it. This small thing had been in a drawer somewhere, or a pocket somewhere, for 10 years. 10 years was the entire length of his life, as far as he was concerned. Everything that had happened to him had happened in that same time. Hagrid was talking still. Something kind about the train and being sure to look for the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. Harry was listening, and not listening at once, the way you listen to rain. The 3rd of November, 1981, 3 days after his parents died, Dumbledore had registered his name on this key. He put the key in his pocket and felt it settle there, small and certain. Tomorrow he would go back to the Dursleys for 4 more weeks. He would sleep in his cupboard and eat whatever wasn't wanted, and he would think with new and specific precision about what he didn't know yet and about what he intended to find out. Sirius Orion Black, whose name had been there first? Dumbledore, who had put his own name in Sirius's place? Harry had been asking questions his whole life, and had mostly gotten silence in return. But he was starting to understand that the right question, asked in the right place, was something different from silence. The right question was an answer waiting to happen. He had one. The month back at Privet Drive had been exactly what Harry had expected it to be, which is to say, long and quiet in the way of a held breath, full of the particular domestic silence that happens when everyone in a house is pretending something isn't there. The Dursleys had not asked where he'd gone. They had not asked about Hedwig, who regarded the household with the polite neutrality of something far above such concerns, or about the pile of unfamiliar textbooks in his room, or about why he spent his evenings reading with a concentration that had never been applied to anything the Dursleys considered useful. They pretended he was invisible. He had spent 10 years practicing invisibility. It suited him fine. He thought about the key. He turned over the date, the 3rd of November 1981, 3 days after his parents died, the way you turn over a question you can't yet answer, but don't want to lose. He thought about the name that had been superseded. He read his textbooks cover to cover. He waited for September. King's Cross arrived, the way important days often do, too quickly and with too much to carry. Harry stood with his trolley in the middle of the concourse and read the signs above him, and decided that looking confident was more useful than feeling it. He had a ticket that said Platform 9 3/4. He had a barrier somewhere between the real platforms 9 and 10. He had one brief conversation with Hagrid a month ago and absolutely no further instructions. Platform 9 3/4 now, Percy first. The voice that found him through the noise of the station was warm and carrying. The voice of a person who organized several people at once as a matter of ordinary life. Harry turned toward it. The family moving along the concourse was large and unmistakable, not for their size, though one of the older boys was considerably tall, but for the way they occupied the space around them, loudly and completely, everyone talking and nobody walking in quite the same direction. The mother was short and round and had the kind of bright red hair that seemed to run generationally, and a kind face currently doing the work of keeping 5 children on schedule. The father walked beside her, thin, balding in a muggle suit that fit him with the cheerful inexactness of someone who had dressed enthusiastically in an unfamiliar idiom. He had glasses and an expression of mild, pleased interest in everything around him. Their children, a tall boy with a prefect badge and a slightly proprietary manner about it, 2 identical red-haired boys with identical wide grins, who were currently arguing about something without any apparent interest in resolving it. A younger red-haired boy, gangly and tall for his age, dragging a trunk and an owl cage, 10 or thereabouts, who was walking with the studied composure of someone who had decided this morning that she was absolutely fine, and had been maintaining that position with visible effort ever since. Harry watched the tall boy walk straight at the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 and vanish. Then one of the grinning ones. Then the other. Right then, he ended up next to the gangly red-haired boy by something that was partly coincidence and partly the fact that Harry had been making himself seem less lost for most of his life. And this particular skill translated to train platforms. Ron Weasley, the boy said, extending his hand with the easy friendliness of someone who had never found meeting people difficult. Harry Potter, Ron's eyes went automatically to his forehead, then back to his face with what Harry recognized as a genuine attempt at recovering. He was not entirely successful, but the attempt was there, and that counted for something. They went through the barrier together. The Scarlet engine stood waiting on the other side in clouds of white steam, and the platform was a different kind of crowd, all school trunks and owl cages and families shouting last instructions, and Harry stood in the middle of it and felt, for the first time in his life, like he might be standing somewhere he was meant to be. Molly Weasley gathered her children with the efficient warmth of a woman who had done this before and would do it several more times, and intended to feel it fully each time. She folded Ron into a hug and held him a beat longer than schedule strictly required. The small girl, Ginny, Harry caught the name, accepted a tissue and the firm assurance that next year would come, and kept her chin up. Harry, watching, felt something he didn't try to name. On the train, Ron found a compartment, and Harry followed him in. They talked about Hogwarts. Ron knew a great deal about Hogwarts, had been hearing about it his whole life, he said with the rueful familiarity of a person who was the last to arrive at a party every member of his family had attended before him. He talked about the houses and the ghosts and the moving staircases. He produced a paper bag of every flavor beans, and Harry tried one that tasted like parchment, and one that tasted unmistakably of earwax, and one that was actually quite nice, like warm toffee. After a while, Harry said carefully, the way he had learned to ask things, likely, as if the answer didn't particularly matter, "Do you know much about Azkaban?" Ron looked up. The prison? He seemed to consider how much. It's not somewhere you want to end up. It's guarded by Dementors. Dad says Dementors are the worst things there are, and Dad's not dramatic about things usually. So he shrugged a little. Why? I was just reading over the summer. I wondered whether whether someone could be sent there without a trial. Ron turned this over. I don't know. I don't think I've ever heard about that either way. He was curious now. The casual, open curiosity of someone who stored interesting things up. Is that about something specific? Not sure yet, Harry said, which was true, and the subject settled where it fell. Hermione Granger arrived at the door of their compartment not long after, holding a piece of paper and wearing the expression of someone conducting a methodical search. She was looking for a toad belonging to a round-faced, sandy-haired boy who appeared in the doorway behind her with the particular combination of sheepish and hopeful that belongs to people whose animals have escaped and who want very much to be wrong about where they've gone. His name was Neville Longbottom, and the toad was named Trevor, and Hermione had already checked 4 other compartments. She had bushy brown hair and rather large front teeth and brown eyes that moved across the space quickly, taking inventory. She also had, Harry noticed, an already well-thumbed copy of one of their second-year textbooks open on top of her first-year one, which seemed like a choice. She already knew who Harry was. She said so straightforwardly, which Harry found easier than the versions that tried to make it into something more elaborate. Trevor turned up under the seat 2 minutes into the search, which made Neville so relieved he sat down immediately. Outside the windows, England turned into Scotland in increments, the hills getting darker and larger and the sky pressing lower until the train was moving through something that was less a landscape and more a statement about weather. The boats were small and the lake was black and the castle was lit. Harry had been told about Hogwarts, he had read about it. He had looked at the illustration in his History of Magic textbook and thought he understood the scale. He had understood nothing. It rose out of the dark above the lake with all its towers and turrets, lit from within so that each window was a separate warm square against the stone, and it was not the size of it that struck him first, though it was very large, but the age. It was old in the way that made everything else seem recently arrived. It sat on its high promontory above the black water, as if it had decided to be there before the word for permanence was invented. Harry looked at it from the boat and did not say anything. Neither did Ron, who was beside him. Some things don't want commentary. Max A.G. Gonagall met them in the entrance hall. Small, straight-backed, dark emerald robes, hair in a severe bun, square spectacles over sharp eyes. She spoke briefly and precisely, and with the authority of someone who had been running this particular moment for decades and had no patience for the variations that didn't improve upon the original. They waited in a side chamber while she went ahead, then the great hall, and the Sorting Hat on its stool. Harry did not hear what the hat sang mostly. He was standing in 400 years of tradition, with his heart doing something complicated, and trying to look like someone who had expected this. The hat sang about the houses. He noted the broad strokes. When his name was called, the hall went quiet with the particular quality of held breath, and he sat on the stool, and the hat came down over his eyes, and the world reduced to darkness. The voice that arrived inside his head was old and dry and interested, not unkind, but entirely without sentimentality, the voice of something that had spent centuries at a task it took seriously. It considered him. He was aware of being considered. Gryffindor, it said, with something that might have been satisfaction. The table on his left erupted. He went and sat down, shook hands with several people whose names he would learn in the days ahead, and watched Ron come across from the stool a few minutes later, and Hermione after a brief deliberation, and Neville last, with the slightly stunned expression of a person who had expected worse. And then Dumbledore stood up at the top of the hall. Harry had not been looking at the staff table, particularly. He had been watching the sorting, watching Ron, watching the hall fill. But when the tall figure at the center of the top table rose, the hall's attention moved that direction the way attention moves toward something it has been waiting for. And Harry's moved with it. He was very tall and very thin, with silver hair that fell past his shoulders and a silver beard long enough to be a notable feature of the room. He wore deep, midnight blue robes and half-moon spectacles over bright blue eyes, and he had a crooked nose that looked as though it had been broken at some point and had healed at a slight opinion about the original direction. He stood at the podium with the ease of a man who had inhabited authority for so long that it no longer required effort, and he looked out across the full great hall with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. He said, welcoming things. He said something warm about the feast, and something brief about the rules, and something that got a laugh from the older students. He had the kind of voice that carried in the particular way of voices that have said important things and have learned to pace themselves for it. Harry listened. He ate the roast chicken that materialized in front of him. He talked to the Gryffindors on either side of him with a portion of his attention and used the rest to watch. He was 11 years old, and he had been at Hogwarts for 40 minutes, and he was sitting in a room with the man who had walked into Gringotts 3 days after his parents died and registered his name on a vault key. He looked like a man who was kind to everyone. He probably was kind to everyone. Harry had no reason on this first night to think otherwise. He had a date and a name and a record from a bank, and Dumbledore was standing 20 feet away, looking pleased about everything, and the roast chicken was very good, and Harry thought, I need to be patient. I need to learn this place first. I need to understand what I'm doing before I do anything. He turned back to the table and let himself be ordinary for one evening. He was, after all, practiced at waiting. The potions classroom was in the dungeons and smelled of things that had been boiled for a long time. Harry found his seat beside Ron, got out his textbook and his notes, and spent the first few minutes memorizing the room the way he had memorized every room he'd ever needed to get through without incident. The shelves of pickled specimens along the walls, the stone floor, the single door, the blackboard that was still blank. He had a habit of doing this. It had never stopped being useful. Professor Snape arrived. Without announcement, and silence followed him in. He was tall and thin, with black hair that fell to his shoulders, and skin that had the particular pallor of someone who spent most of their time underground, which in this case was accurate. He had black eyes and a hooked nose, and his robes were dark and voluminous in a way that seemed to move slightly ahead of him, and he surveyed the room with the economical appraisal of someone who had been assessing rooms full of first years for years. He called the register, paused at Harry's name. "Ah," he said, "Harry Potter." He looked up. "Our new celebrity." Harry said nothing. He had been famous for 3 weeks, and had already formed a strong preference for people who declined to comment on it. Snape asked him about asphodel and wormwood. Harry didn't know. He asked about bezoars. He asked about the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane, and Harry didn't know that either, and Ron muttered beside him that they hadn't studied any of this yet, which Snape acknowledged by turning his gaze in Ron's direction until the muttering stopped. "Fame," Snape said, returning to Harry with the measured deliberation of someone who had composed this sentence in advance, "is not, Mr. Potter, a substitute for preparation. 1 point from Gryffindor." Harry copied the instructions off the board and started on his potion, and watched Snape move through the room for the remaining 40 minutes of the lesson. He was observing the way he would observe any situation he needed to understand, not resentfully, but practically, because understanding how something operated was always more useful than reacting to it. What he understood, by the end of the class, Snape was technically precise and thoroughly prepared, and had made a decision about Harry before Harry had done anything to deserve it. He was also, and this was more interesting, exactly as cutting as he had decided to be, and no more, every word measured. Total control of the instrument. That kind of control was a choice that took effort. Harry filed that away. Transfiguration was nothing like potions. Professor McGonagall had waited for the room to settle into complete silence. She waited it out with the patience of a person who had practiced waiting, and then, without any announcement, transformed her desk into a large pig, and then back into a desk again. The pig had blinked once, with the resigned expression of something that had been briefly and inexplicably inconvenienced. And then it was a desk, and McGonagall said, "Now, today we will begin with the theory." She was small and straight-backed, with a severe bun and square spectacles, and she was rigorous in a way that was entirely unlike Snape's precision. McGonagall's was a standard she applied to herself first. She took 15 minutes to explain the theory behind a matchstick-to-needle transformation, and then 30 minutes to walk the room while they attempted it, and she helped students who raised their hands with the same focused attention she'd given the lecture. She did not single Harry out when his matchstick grew a silver tip. She said, "Good, Mr. Potter," and moved on. And Harry thought there was something almost deliberate about the evenness of that. He thought she would argue. If someone wanted to do something she thought was wrong, she would argue about it. He wasn't sure why he was so certain. It was something in the quality of her fairness, the way she gave a room the same attention she gave a problem she was taking seriously. He thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, and didn't know yet what to do with it. 3 weeks into term, Harry found Hermione in the library on a Thursday evening. She had 3 books open simultaneously and was writing 2 separate sets of notes, which seemed ambitious even for her. She looked up when he sat down, evaluated the interruption, and kept one pen moving. "Is there anything here," Harry said, "about guardianship laws for wizarding orphans? Who decides where they go?" She looked at him properly then. It was the look of someone sorting what they'd just heard before deciding how to respond. "I can find out," she said. "What are you looking for, exactly? Whether there's a formal process, whether a designated guardian has legal standing." "I'll look." She wrote something on the second set of notes in a different hand, faster, shorthand, a category for things to find rather than things already found. Ron arrived 20 minutes later with his charms essay in one hand and a troubled expression, and dropped into the chair beside Harry. "What are you two doing?" "Guardianship laws," Hermione said, without looking up. "Why?" Harry had spent 3 weeks deciding how much to say. "My parents had a plan for what happened to me," he said. "If something happened to them, I want to know whether the plan was followed." Ron turned this over slowly. Harry had found, a kind of instinctive seriousness that lived underneath the easy surface. It didn't show up constantly, but when it did, it was reliable. "Right," Ron said, finally. He opened his charms essay. "Okay." That was that. The path to Hagrid's hut curved along the edge of the castle grounds, and then down toward the Forbidden Forest, and Harry walked it on a Saturday in early October, with the sense of having worked toward something for several weeks. Hagrid opened the door at the first knock, looking unsurprised, and already had the kettle on. The hut was small and warm, and smelled of something animal and something baked, and Hagrid's enormous boarhound Fang immediately settled his enormous head on Harry's knee and required extended attention. The rock cakes that appeared on the table were, as advertised, the weight and approximate consistency of the geological objects they were named for, and Harry took one and didn't eat it and held it companionably. They talked about the merits of various Quidditch positions and whether Gryffindor's current seeker was going to retire. They talked about the castle's ghosts and the moving staircases, and the way the Forbidden Forest was not as forbidden as Professor McGonagall made it sound, though Hagrid said this last part with the conviction of someone who knew exactly how forbidden it was and considered that a feature. Then Harry said, keeping his voice easy, "The night you picked me up after my parents died. How did you get me to Privet Drive?" Hagrid blinked. "Flying motorbike. Whose was it?" The question landed in the silence of the hut. The fire crackled. Fang's tail swept the floor twice. "Young Sirius Black lent it to me," Hagrid said slowly. He was there when I arrived at the cottage that night." "Yes." Hagrid looked at his tea. "I had my orders. Dumbledore had sent me to get you and bring you to your aunt's. Sirius was already at the cottage when I got there. He'd found it before me, I reckon. He wanted to take you, said you were his godfather's right." Hagrid's voice was slow and heavy, moving over the words the way you move over ground you're not certain of. "I told him I had my orders. Dumbledore said to bring you to the Dursleys." A pause. "He gave me the bike, said he wouldn't be needing it." The fire shifted. Outside, the grounds were quiet in the thin October light. Sirius Black had come back to Godric's Hollow. He had stood in the ruins of the house he had supposedly sent Voldemort to, and instead of doing what guilty people did when they were found near the evidence, he had tried to take Harry, had argued for it, had given away his motorbike and walked away alone. Harry thought about this and did not say what he was thinking. Hagrid believed what he believed, and nothing Harry said right now would change it. And that wasn't the point of this conversation anyway. "Thanks, Hagrid," he said, and meant it. He walked back up to the castle in the early dark. That night, after the dormitory had gone quiet, Harry sat at his desk and wrote a letter to Gringotts Wizarding Bank. He was requesting, as account holder, a complete account history of his vault, all key custody registrations with dates, and any trustee designations entered into the account by the original account holder with dates. He wrote it once and looked at it. He wrote it again with different words, trying to sound like someone who knew what they were asking. He found Hermione after breakfast the next morning. "Can you read this?" he said. "Tell me if it sounds right." She read it standing in the corridor, which she was perfectly capable of doing. Made 3 corrections, a phrasing that would have been ambiguous, a spelling, and 1 sentence that she restructured entirely with 2 strokes of her pen. "That should do it," she said. She did not ask what it was for. He went up to the owlery. The morning was grey and cold, and the air smelled of coming rain. Hedwig turned her amber eyes on him the moment he came through the door, and when he held out the sealed letter, she took it in her talons with the purposeful economy of someone who had been waiting for something useful to do. She was gone in 3 wingbeats, south and then smaller, until the sky closed over where she'd been. Harry stood at the window. The grounds below him were wet and wide and real, and somewhere under London, a bank of goblins kept records of everything. And one of those records had his name on it, and he had asked to see it. He was still the boy who had never owned anything. He couldn't fit in a sock under a floorboard, but he was starting, carefully, to learn how to ask. Hedwig arrived at breakfast in late October. Harry knew before he'd fully registered it, a flash of white at the high windows, precise and unhurried in the way Hedwig moved when she'd been carrying something important and had been patient about it for some time. She found him at the Gryffindor table in the Great Hall, landed on his shoulder with the composed authority of something that did not do undignified arrivals, and held out her leg. The parchment she carried was sealed with wax and rolled tightly and tied with a dark ribbon, and the seal was a G worked into a goblin face, small, dense, formal. It had the weight of something composed by people who understood that documents outlasted everything else and wrote accordingly. Harry was aware of the eyes that followed her, because eyes always followed Hedwig. She was remarkable enough on her own, and he was Harry Potter. And anything that happened to Harry Potter at breakfast was immediately interesting to the surrounding tables. He untied the ribbon, read the first line, rolled the parchment up again, and tucked it inside his robes. "Done eating," he said to Ron, who was not done eating but picked up his remaining toast anyway. They found an empty classroom off the 2nd-floor corridor, the kind that sat locked between astronomy club sessions, and Hermione arrived 2 minutes after they did, which meant she had been expecting something like this. Ron had brought his toast. Harry spread the parchment on the table. It was written in a small, precise hand that belonged to people for whom records were not a formality but a practice, and it moved through what it had to say without economy of detail and without embellishment. The vault had been registered to James Fleamont Potter. The date of the original account's creation was not provided. At the time of the original account's opening, a trustee designate had been entered, Sirius Orion Black. On the 3rd day of November, 1981, that designation had been superseded. Key custody had been transferred to Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. On the 31st day of July 1991, key custody had been transferred to Rubeus Hagrid for the purpose of transport to the account holder. No withdrawals had been recorded during the period of Dumbledore's custodianship. He stopped. The three of them looked at the document. "So Dumbledore took over your vault 2 days after they put Sirius in Azkaban," Ron said. Yes, Ron's toast was no longer being eaten. What was Dumbledore planning to spend your money on? "It says no withdrawals, Ron," Hermione said. "I know what it says." Ron's voice was the particular even register he used when he was thinking more than he was talking, which was not his most common register, but was reliable. "I'm asking what he was planning, because no withdrawals means he didn't spend it, but it doesn't mean he didn't intend to. And either way, whether he was going to do something with it or nothing with it, why is his name on it? Why not a solicitor? Why not leave it at the bank in trust and let the goblins manage it? He didn't have to hold the key himself." The classroom was quiet. "He didn't," Hermione said. "That's true." She was in the mode Harry had come to recognize as her actual thinking mode, which was different from her answering mode, in that it was slower, and she looked at something slightly to the left of what she was discussing. She did this for a moment. Holding the key personally was a choice among several options, she said. A vault with a minor account holder in circumstances like Harry's, both parents dead, no legal guardian in a position to act, that could have been administered any number of ways. The goblins could hold it in escrow. A ministry-appointed administrator could hold it. A family solicitor, if the Potters had one, could hold it. Dumbledore, choosing to hold it himself, says something about how he thought of the situation. She paused. He thought of Harry's affairs as personally his to manage, which might mean he was being protective, but it also might mean something else. "What else?" Harry said. She didn't answer immediately. That he didn't want anyone in a position to ask questions about it. That keeping it personally meant he controlled what questions could be asked and by whom. The three of them sat with this. The morning light came through the classroom window at a low October angle and lay across the table. And the document on it, Harry looked at the names again. They were more real than they had been even in August, which he hadn't expected. He'd thought seeing it in writing would confirm what he already knew, but instead it did something else. It made it permanent. Sirius Orion Black, the name James Potter had written into a bank account because it was his answer to the question of who should have Harry if things went wrong. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, the name that had replaced it, 4 days after James Potter had died. 3 days, Harry didn't know yet. He hadn't looked it up. When exactly Sirius had been taken to Azkaban? He didn't know whether November 3rd fell on a specific side of that, whether it came before or after or the same day. He just knew that it had been fast. 3 days after his parents were killed, while the wizarding world was apparently still lighting fireworks and saying the name of a 1-year-old to strangers, a man had walked into Gringotts and arranged things. It was very quick. The quickness of it had been sitting with Harry since August like a stone in a pocket, present all the time, never comfortable, impossible to stop noticing. "I want to know if Sirius was given a trial," Harry said. Ron looked at him. He was sent to Azkaban. Harry kept his voice flat and steady, the voice he used for things he'd already decided. "I want to know whether there was a formal trial before that happened." "I'll look," Hermione said immediately, and opened her notes. Wizengamot hearings are matters of public record. It might take time to find, but if there was one, there'll be documentation, and if there wasn't one, Ron said, then there won't be. Ron turned his toast over in his hands. He had the expression of someone who had arrived at a conclusion through instinct rather than evidence, and was now checking whether the instinct held up. "If he was sent to Azkaban without a trial," Ron said, "that's wrong. I want to be clear about that. Even if he did everything they say he did, betrayed your parents, killed those people, all of it, if they didn't give him a trial first, That's still wrong. The trial isn't about being nice to him. It's about the process being what it's supposed to be. If you can skip the trial when you think someone's guilty, you can skip it whenever you want. That's the whole point of having one. Neither Harry nor Hermione said anything for a moment. "Right," Harry said. "Yes." He rolled up the parchment. He put it inside his robes, in the pocket that now held both the document and the vault key, the key that had been in Dumbledore's possession for 10 years before it was in Harry's. He had carried it since August, every day, because it was the beginning of the question, and he was not in the habit of putting down things that were important until he knew what he had in his hand. He thought he was starting to know. "We should get to class," he said, and stood up. Outside the window, October moved over the grounds, in its particular grey and golden way. The lake was dark. The forbidden forest was the colour of something that had been rusting slowly for a long time. Harry put on his bag and held the door for the other two. He had a document now. He had names. He had a question about a trial, and Hermione was going to look into it, and Ron had said the thing out loud that Harry had been turning over in some form or another since the day he'd stood in Gringotts and a goblin had read from a ledger, and the morning had changed. If you can skip the trial when you think someone's guilty, you can skip it whenever you want. That was the point. That had been the point the whole time. He went to class. The 31st of October arrived with pumpkins in the Great Hall, and a quality of attention in Harry's chest that he didn't know what to do with. He had known the date was coming. He had watched October move through its weeks with the particular awareness of someone waiting for a specific thing, and when he woke that morning, and the light coming through the dormitory curtains was the same light it had been the day before, he sat on the edge of his bed for a moment and let himself be 11 years old and aware of the date. 10 years ago, tonight, his parents had died. He had known that since the age of 2 or 3, in the vague, not quite formed way, that you know things about yourself before you have the vocabulary to think about them. He had grown up knowing it the way he'd grown up knowing he was unwanted, which was to say, it was simply true in the way that rain is true, without requiring ongoing examination, but this year he was sitting inside it differently. He thought about the ages. James Potter had died at 21. Lily Potter had died at 21. He was 11. They had been 11 once too, presumably sitting in these same halls. And then they had been 21, and then they had been gone. And the whole span from here to there was 10 years, which was the exact length of everything he had yet lived. He thought about the 7th years in the Great Hall, the ones who were 17 and 18, and thought, my parents had only 3 more years than them when they died. He went to breakfast and ate carefully, and talked to Ron about the Quidditch season, and was present enough that nothing was noticeable. He had spent his whole life practicing not being noticeable. The Halloween feast was elaborate. Hundreds of live bats circling the enchanted ceiling alongside the floating pumpkins, great golden platters of food, candles at every table. Harry ate and watched, and tried to locate in himself something ceremonial, some appropriate feeling for the date. What he found instead was a kind of flat, dry recognition. Not grief, exactly, or like the acknowledgement of an absence so long-standing that it had become structural, like a wall with a window that had never had glass in it. He was still looking for the right feeling when Quirinus Quirrell burst through the doors. The defense against the dark arts professor was slight and nervous-mannered as a general rule, and he was both of these things to a maximized degree as he stumbled into the hall, his purple turban slightly askew, and announced in a high, carrying voice that there was a troll in the dungeon. Thought you ought to know, and then fainted. The hall erupted. Dumbledore restored order in seconds, which Harry noted from the corner of his attention. The way the whole room snapped to attention at his raised hand, the absolute quality of the authority, and then Dumbledore directed the prefects to lead the students back to the dormitories by house. Harry and Ron were moving with the Gryffindor column when Harry realized, "Hermione," he said. Ron's face changed. "She doesn't know. She was in the bathroom. She didn't come to the feast. They went the other way." The corridor was emptying fast, the sounds of the crowd moving upward and away, and Harry and Ron moved against the current and then down the main staircase toward the first-floor girls' bathroom, where Parvati Patil had mentioned at lunch that Hermione had been spending some time lately. After Ron had made a remark that morning that Parvati had apparently repeated, Harry had not entirely followed the social mechanics of what had happened, but he understood the basic shape of it. They were outside the bathroom door when they smelled it. Something damp and very old and unpleasant, and the sound of something large in a space not quite large enough for it. Harry and Ron looked at each other, and Ron pushed the door open, and the mountain troll was there. It was enormous. That was the first thing, just the size of it, 12 feet, if it was an inch, grey and lumpen and moving with the slow, brutish confidence of something that had never been in a situation it couldn't resolve by hitting harder. It was swinging a club the size of a small tree. Hermione was in the far corner, pressed against the sinks, and she was not making any noise, which Harry understood immediately as the paralysis of real fear, the kind that is not like the fear in stories. What happened next was not particularly graceful. Harry ran at the troll because there was a person in the corner, and the troll was between them, and there was nothing else to do, and jumped for its back and got high enough to grab one of its enormous arms, and in the scrambling chaos of trying not to fall, he shoved his wand somewhere on the troll's face, and the troll reacted with the surprised. A fronted bellow of something that had just had a wand pushed into its nostril, and wheeled and staggered, and Ron. Harry heard him shout the incantation, sent the troll's own club swinging upward by Wingardium Leviosa, and then dropping straight down. The troll sat down heavily on the stone floor. Then it went sideways. The silence afterward was very loud. Harry extracted himself from the vicinity of the unconscious troll, and straightened his glasses with the hand that wasn't shaking. Hermione had slid down the wall to sitting. Ron's wand was still in the air like he hadn't remembered to lower it yet. McGonagall arrived with Snape and Quirrell behind her, and her expression underwent a rapid and impressive series of internal events before settling on severity. There were some minutes of explanation. Hermione, who Harry had not expected to lie for anyone, told McGonagall she had gone looking for the troll herself, that she had read about them, that it wasn't Ron and Harry's fault they had followed her. McGonagall gave her a sharp look that suggested she found this account improbable but not unprovable. They lost 5 points from Gryffindor, each for being out of the dormitories. Harry thought this was reasonable given the circumstances. Walking back to Gryffindor Tower, the three of them were quiet in the particular way of people who have recently been in immediate danger and are still recalibrating. By the time they reached the common room, the atmosphere was different. Not warm, exactly, too tired for warmth, but settled. The kind of settled that happens when you've seen how someone handles something real. The fire was low, and most of Gryffindor was upstairs already. Harry sat on the floor with his back against the sofa, and Ron sat beside him, and Hermione, after a moment, sat on the sofa itself. Harry's wrist hurt where the troll had knocked it. He didn't mention this. "I found it," Hermione said after a while. Harry looked up. "What you asked me to look for. Sirius Black's trial. She had her notes because she had her notes for everything, but she didn't open them. She'd clearly read them enough times that she didn't need to. There wasn't one. He was taken directly to Azkaban on the 1st of November 1981, the day after your parents died. No Wizengamot hearing was convened. No formal charges were filed. He was imprisoned based on the testimony of ministry officials who had been at the scene. Ron said, "But you can't just do that." Apparently they did. That's wrong. He said it the way he had said it in the classroom a week ago, with the same flat certainty, and Harry realized it was not something Ron needed to think about. He'd been raised in a family where the rules were followed because they meant something, not because they were written down. The Ministry of Magic was his father's workplace. The idea that the ministry had skipped a trial because skipping it was convenient was not something Ron could locate a comfortable framework for. It's just wrong. "I know," Hermione said. "I know it is." Harry was quiet. He was looking at the fire and thinking about what it meant. Now to add this to what he already had. Sirius Black. No trial. Dumbledore. In the same November, in the same chaos of those days. Dumbledore, who had organized the whole of those first days, who had been. Harry now understood, the person who made the decisions. Where Harry went. Who handled Harry's affairs. Dumbledore sat at the top table in the great hall, and the whole hall attended to him when he raised his hand. He held titles Harry barely understood, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, among others, and people who had been doing magic since before Harry was born deferred to him the way you defer to something that has existed long enough to be true by default. In 1981, a man like that had the standing to ask for a trial. Harry did not know whether Dumbledore had held those exact titles then. He hadn't looked it up yet, but he knew what he had seen in the Great Hall on his first night, and he knew what it meant about what Dumbledore could do if he chose to do it. The standing did not come from a title, it came from being the person the room quieted for. Did he know, Harry thought? Did he know there was no trial? And if he knew, did he ask? The fire shifted. Ron was asleep against the sofa already, which was the enviable ability of someone who had processed things and would worry about them tomorrow. Hermione had opened a book, but wasn't reading it. Harry thought, I want to ask him. He thought, not yet. He was 11. Dumbledore was 110. The imbalance of that had been clear to him since the first night, and it had not gone away. A bad question would produce deflection, a kind, warm deflection delivered with twinkling blue eyes, the kind that felt like an answer until you were out of the room and realized nothing had been said. He had already seen enough of the world to know that people with authority and good intentions were still capable of managing a conversation in any direction they wanted, and that 11-year-olds with one document from a bank were not, generally, in a strong position. He needed to be in a stronger position. He didn't know yet exactly what that looked like. But he was building something, here in the common room, and in the library, and in the conversations where Ron said the obvious true thing and Hermione found the evidence, and Harry listened and stored it away. He was assembling something carefully, the way you assemble a question that doesn't give the person being questioned a way to walk around it. He could be patient. He had always been patient. The fire burned low. Late November settled over Hogwarts with a grey, heavy patience, the kind of weather that made the castle feel more itself, older and heavier, and more certain of its permanence. The lake went dark and still. The Forbidden Forest became a solid, dark mass against the horizon, without the individual trees you could pick out in autumn. Harry walked the path to Hagrid's hut, alone in the late afternoon, his collar turned up, his hands in his pockets. He had not brought the Gringotts document. He had not told Ron or Hermione where he was going. not because he wanted to keep it from them, but because this particular question felt like one he needed to ask without company. Some things you had to do in pairs, some things you had to do alone. Hagrid opened the door before Harry had finished knocking. Harry. Something in Hagrid's face rearranged itself. Not surprise exactly. More like someone who had been expecting a thing and was adjusting to it actually arriving. Come in, then. Kettle's on. Fang took the opportunity of Harry's entrance to rest, his enormous head on Harry's knee as soon as Harry sat down, which was a thing Fang did without asking, and seemed to consider a courtesy. Harry scratched him behind one ear. The hut was warm and smelled of something that had been roasting and something wood smoke, and outside the wind moved through the trees at the edge of the forest in a way that was almost peaceful. Hagrid set down 2 mugs and a plate of rock cakes, with the straightforward hospitality of a man who showed care through food, regardless of whether the food was edible, and settled into his chair. "All right?" Harry looked at his mug. "I wanted to ask you something." Hagrid waited. He was good at waiting. He had the physical patience of something large that had decided to be still. "The night you picked me up," Harry said. "The night my parents died. Will you tell me about it?" He paused. "Not about Sirius. Not about any of that. I mean about you. What you saw when you got there." Hagrid's hand stilled around his mug. "Harry, I don't think—" "Not what happened before. Not the politics of it, or who did what, to who. Just what you saw when you arrived." Hagrid let out a breath that was slow and complicated, the breath of someone setting something down that had been heavy for a long time. "Yeah," he said. "All right." Dumbledore had sent him, Hagrid said, and that was the beginning of it, a message, late on the night of the 31st. "Come now, go to Godric's Hollow, bring Harry to safety." He'd gone on the motorbike, borrowed from Sirius, which was the fastest way he knew. The village of Godric's Hollow was quiet when he arrived. He'd been half hoping, he said, and then stopped and started again. That was the first thing. The upper floor was destroyed. There had been an explosion. Harry knew that much from what he'd read, what happened when the killing curse rebounded off him, and half the structure was rubble. Hagrid had stood at the edge of it in the dark, and the only thing he'd thought, he said, was that he hoped. He'd hoped very hard that the Potters had been out. They hadn't been out. Hagrid went quiet for a moment. He was looking at the fire in his grate, not at Harry, with the focus of someone who had decided that a fixed point was necessary. "James was downstairs," he said. He'd gone to face him without his wand, they reckon. He was on the floor, in the entrance hall." A pause. Lily was upstairs. She'd got between your father and you, and him, and she wouldn't move. She hadn't moved. The hut was very quiet. "You were in your cot," Hagrid said. "Second floor, the part that was still standing. You had a cut on your forehead, and you were crying, and when I picked you up, you stopped." He looked at Harry then, and his beetle-black eyes were bright. "You stopped crying the moment I picked you up. I don't know why I remember that so clearly, but I do." Harry did not say anything. There was not anything to say in the particular way that certain things are not made better or worse by words. "Sirius was there," Hagrid said. He said it the way you say something that you have been not saying for a while, until the effort of not saying it becomes greater than the effort of saying it. "He arrived while I was still in the cottage making sure there wasn't anyone else. He'd come on. I don't know how he'd got there. He was on foot by then. He must have apparated near the village. He came in through what was left of the door. Harry was very still. He wanted to take you," Hagrid said. "He said it was his right. Being your godfather. He said Dumbledore had no right to decide that you were his, and he'd take you to safety somewhere. You know whose lot would never find you." Hagrid's voice had gone slow and effortful. "I told him I had my orders." "Dumbledore had said to bring you to your aunt's," Sirius argued. It wasn't cold, what he was saying. He was frantic, almost, like a man who has lost something enormous. "He gave me the bike," Hagrid said finally. "Said he wouldn't need it anymore." He turned his mug in his enormous hands. "I didn't understand that at the time. I thought he meant he'd find another way to get wherever he was going. I understand it better now." Harry thought about this. Sirius Black had come to Godric's Hollow after the murders. He had come to a place where he had, supposedly, deliberately sent Voldemort. He had stood in the ruins of the house he had allegedly helped destroy, and he had tried to take the baby he'd been named to protect. And when that was refused, he had handed away his motorbike and walked away. And then, less than a day later, he'd been taken to Azkaban. He had come back to the ruins. Harry held that detail the way you hold a detail that is not proof, but is something. Not the behavior of a guilty man, some part of him wanted to say, and then he stopped himself because he had been wrong about things before and he did not yet know enough to be certain of anything. But it was not nothing. It was the behavior of a man in grief, moving toward the last thing he could still reach. "You believed he did it," Harry said. "Yes," Hagrid said it simply. "When they told me, after I believed it." He set down his mug. "I loved your mum and dad, Harry. I loved them the way you love people who treated you like you were worth something when you weren't sure you were. And when they told me what Sirius had done, He stopped. "I didn't ask questions. I believed it because I needed there to be an explanation that made sense. If Sirius did it, then there was a reason, and a reason was something I could hold on to." He looked at the fire. "If there wasn't a reason, then there was just a man who wanted to hurt people, and it could have been anyone, and I—" He stopped again. Harry understood. Hagrid had not questioned it because questioning it would have meant questioning the only story that made the loss survivable, the story that said, someone specific for a specific reason, with a beginning and a cause. The story that said the world still made the kind of sense where things happened because someone chose them. He thought about the vault key. James Potter had walked into Gringotts before the war ended. Before any of this, while he was still alive and planning for contingencies, and he had written a name into an account because he trusted that person above anyone else with the thing he cared about most. You did not put someone's name in a bank account for a child you didn't trust them with. You did not name someone a godfather if you thought they might one day choose against you. He had enough. Not proof. Not the thing that would make a court act, but enough to know that the story he had been given was, at minimum, incomplete. He walked back up to the castle in the dark, hands in his pockets, the vault key solid and small against his fingers. That night, after the dormitory had gone quiet, he sat at his desk and got out a piece of parchment. He wrote at the top, "Dear Sirius." He sat there for a long time with the quill in his hand, looking at those two words. He did not know what Sirius looked like. He had no picture, no description, nothing except the idea of a man who had stood in the ruins of a house in the dark and tried to claim a baby, and then given away the only vehicle he owned. He did not know what kind of person Sirius was, what he talked like, what he laughed at, what he'd been before Azkaban had made him, into whatever he was now. 10 years in that place was not something Harry had the vocabulary for. He had read about Dementors by now, enough to know that whatever was in Azkaban was not quite what had walked away from Godric's Hollow. He did not know if a letter would reach a prisoner there. He did not know if there was a system for it, or if letters were intercepted, or if they arrived but were never read by someone in that state. He did not know what to say. He put the quill down. He looked at the 2 words. He didn't send it, but he folded the parchment and put it in the same pocket as the vault key where it would stay. It seemed important to have written it. It seemed important that the piece of paper existed, with those 2 words on it, because Sirius had only ever been a name in a ledger until tonight, and writing his name in his own hand made him into something else. Someone Harry hadn't met yet. Someone maybe he still could. January settled over the castle like something that had decided to stay. The corridors were colder than they had been in November, cold in the bone-deep way of stone buildings that had absorbed decades of winters and were indifferent to them. The lake was frozen at the edges. Harry walked to the dungeons on a Tuesday afternoon, with his bag on his shoulder and the question turning in his head, the way it always did now, a wheel that could not be stopped by intention. He had been doing this for weeks. He would be reading, or eating breakfast, or watching Quidditch practice from the stands, and the thing would surface how to ask Dumbledore what to say first, whether to show the document immediately or wait and see what Dumbledore offered on his own. He had modeled the conversation so many times that it had begun to feel like something that had already happened, which was dangerous. Because a thing that felt like it had already happened could make you stop paying attention to the thing that was actually in front of you. The potions classroom was already busy when he arrived. He found his seat, got out his ingredients, and told himself to stay present. He did not entirely stay present. He was chopping when he took the wrong jar from the shelf. He did not realize it. Immediately, the contents looked similar at a glance, slightly oily, slightly pale, and he had added half a measure before the color of his potion began to shift in a way that was wrong. Not subtly wrong, the kind you could argue about, unambiguously wrong, a flat gray-green where the potion should have been a pale amber, with a small amount of smoke rising from it that was not supposed to be there. Snape was beside him before Harry had time to react. He had this quality, Snape, a way of being on the other side of the room one moment and at your shoulder the next, as if his movement through the classroom operated on a different set of rules than other people's. He looked at the cauldron, he looked at the jar Harry was still holding. The classroom had gone the way it went when Snape stopped at someone's station, quiet, with the particular attention of people who were grateful not to be the one under scrutiny. "Lacewing flies," Snape said. Harry looked at the jar in his hand. "You added lacewing flies." The voice was level, precise. The voice of someone who had decided that a particular register was the correct one for this situation. "The ingredient I asked you to use was bicorn horn. They have only one property in common, the jar lids." A pause. "Observe what you have produced." Harry observed it. It was still doing something unpleasant in the direction of grey-green. "Dilute it," Snape said, "until it is no longer a danger to the table, and then we will discuss what paying attention in class means in practical terms." Harry diluted it. He did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. He spent the remaining 40 minutes of the lesson working from the board with the heightened precision of someone who had decided that every subsequent step needed to be performed without error, which was at least something. He finished with a potion that was acceptable if not excellent. And he filed the incident under the category of things that happened when you let your concentration drift, and that you did not intend to let happen again. The other students filed out when Snape dismissed them. Harry stood up and began to put his things in his bag. Potter Snape did not look up from where he was making notes at his desk. Stay. The room emptied. The door shut. Snape set down his quill and turned in his chair with the unhurried quality of someone who had time and intended to use it on its own terms. He studied Harry for a moment with the particular focus he had, the kind of look that felt less like an observation and more like an evaluation of everything under the surface, looking for whatever it would find. "You have been distracted," he said. "Not today only, for several weeks." He let the words sit. "Whatever is on your mind does not belong in my classroom, and it has been in my classroom, and it will not be in my classroom again. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." Snape looked at him. The lamp on his desk cast an angled light across the stone wall, across the rows of pickled specimens in their jars, across Snape's angular face. January cold came through the stone. Harry had his bag in his hand, and the question was in his head, and he made a decision, sir. He kept his voice level. Was Sirius Black ever given a trial? The quality of the silence in the room changed. Snape was very still. Not the stillness of someone who had been caught off guard. The stillness of someone who was deciding something with the quality of a person who made such decisions entirely behind the eyes and allowed nothing to the surface until the decision was complete. He looked at Harry for a long, flat moment. "No," he said. The word was simple and final and contained nothing extra. Harry waited. "He was not given a trial," Snape said. His voice had not changed. It was still the same level, cutting register, but it had the precision now of someone choosing exactly how much to give, and no more. In November of 1981, the Ministry of Magic was in a state of chaos. The war had ended 2 weeks prior. Officials were being arrested, interrogated, processed. There were Death Eaters in the holding cells, and a ministry that had been compromised at multiple levels, and a staff that was overwhelmed and in some cases afraid. A pause. Sirius Black was taken to Azkaban on the word of ministry officials who had been present at the arrest. No Wizengamot hearing was convened. No formal charges were recorded. This is a matter of public record. Anyone with access to a library may verify it. He said this as one states a fact that is available to anyone who looks, not apologetically, not with any register of outrage or of grief. Simply, this is what happened. It is known. It can be checked. "Your father's friends," Snape said, "had a talent for trusting the wrong people, Potter, and for blaming the wrong people in turn." He said it the way he said things designed to land, carefully, with the precision of someone who knew where the edge was and placed the words exactly there. He was watching Harry's face when he said it. Harry met his eyes and said nothing. He did not give Snape the reaction he was looking for. He had been in enough conversations with people who were trying to produce a specific response that he knew when one was being attempted, and he knew that the only useful thing to do was not supply it. Instead, he took the words and held them the way he held things that might be useful later, and said, "Thank you, sir." Snape looked at him for a moment longer. Something moved briefly in his expression, difficult to categorize there, and gone before Harry could be sure of it. "Leave," he said. Harry left. The corridor outside was empty. He walked the length of it before stopping at a window that looked out across the grounds, the lake flat and grey under January sky, the forbidden forest dark against the horizon. He stood there long enough to let the things he was thinking settle into their places. He had 2 source confirmations now. Hermione had found it in the library, in Wizengamot records that were public, if you knew where to look. Snape had just confirmed it from memory, in the flat way of someone recounting a known fact. Sirius Black was sent to Azkaban without a trial. This was not rumor. It was not a thing Harry had misunderstood. It was documented, it was verifiable, and it had happened. He thought about the lines Snape had offered at the end of it, blaming the wrong people in turn. He turned it over. Snape had said it as a contemptuous observation about the Marauders, about his father's circle, their habits, their failures of judgment. It was possible it meant nothing beyond that. It was the kind of line Snape delivered to leave a mark and walk away from. But Harry could not stop the thing it did when it landed, the faint double sound of it, like a word with two meanings, one visible and one not quite. He did not know what it pointed to. He was not going to build conclusions from one cutting remark from a man who had reasons of his own to say it. He would note it and carry it and let it be what it was, until it became something more or didn't. He had the Gringotts document. He had the no-trial fact. He had Hagrid's account of Sirius at the ruins. He had two sources confirming the thing Hermione had found. That was enough. He was going to ask Dumbledore. He had spent weeks building the question carefully, iterating it, the way you iterate a thing you're only going to be able to ask once, making sure it was specific, making sure it did not give the person being asked an angle to step around it. He knew what he wanted to say first and what he would say after that, and he knew what he was going to do if Dumbledore answered and what he was going to do if Dumbledore deflected. He was 11 years old, and Dumbledore was 110, and the gap between those two numbers was real. But he had a document in his pocket, and a name on it that should not have been replaced without a trial, and that was a thing that existed in the world independently of how old he was. The grounds were grey and still outside the window. He let his breath out slowly. He was ready. He wrote the note on a Thursday evening in February, in the careful language he had been practicing since September, formal without being stiff, specific without being accusatory. He was requesting a meeting with the headmaster at his earliest convenience regarding a personal matter related to his family's estate. He gave it to McGonagall at the end of Transfiguration on Friday, folded once with his name on the outside. She looked at it, looked at him, and said, "I will pass this along." On Monday she told him, in the same tone she used for everything, that the headmaster would see him Thursday evening at 8 o'clock. He told Ron and Hermione at dinner. Hermione had been waiting for this news since February began. She went, still in the way she did when moving to her focused mode. "Be specific," she said. "Don't lead with the broad question. Ask the one question you can document: the vault key, the registration date, your father's name on the account. Those are facts he can't dispute because they're Gringotts records." She paused. "Save the Sirius question for after he's confirmed the document. If you open with Sirius, he can spend the whole conversation on Sirius and never address the vault at all." Ron had a different perspective, delivered with equal brevity. "Don't let him change the subject." He went back to eating. "He'll try." Harry had been thinking about it for 3 days already, and did not need to be told either of these things, but hearing them said helped. He nodded and ate his dinner, and spent the remaining 4 days not thinking about Thursday, which was to say he thought about Thursday constantly. The entrance to the headmaster's office was a gargoyle on the 7th floor, stone grey and patient. Harry had walked past it many times in the last 6 months without going through it. He said the password McGonagall had given him and watched the gargoyle step aside and the wall behind it spiral open. The office was circular and very full. There were portraits of former headmasters on the walls, many of them dozing. There were instruments Harry didn't recognize arranged on the curved shelves, spinning or ticking or doing things he didn't have the vocabulary for yet. There was a great desk, and behind it, Dumbledore. He was exactly what he was in the Great Hall. Very tall, very thin, silver hair and beard, both long and immaculate. Half-moon spectacles low on a nose that had clearly been broken at some point long before Harry was born. His blue eyes were the quality people seemed to mean when they said blue eyes were piercing. They were alert and warm in the way of someone who was genuinely interested in whoever was in front of them and had learned, over a very long life, how to make that interest feel like a gift. "Harry," he said, as if Harry's arrival were the best development in an evening that had already been pleasant. "Please sit down. Would you like a sweet?" There was a dish of sherbet lemons on the desk. "No, thank you," Harry said. He sat in the chair that was clearly intended for visitors, high-backed, comfortable, slightly lower than Dumbledore's chair, and placed his bag on his knee. "You asked to speak with me about your family's estate," Dumbledore said. He had folded his hands on the desk in a gesture of complete attention. "I am glad you came. I have thought, from time to time, that we ought to have spoken sooner about these matters." "I have a document," Harry said. He reached into his bag and took out the Gringotts account record, the one he had received by Owl in October, which he had carried in the same pocket as the vault key. Since then he placed it on the desk in front of Dumbledore. He did not push it across. He set it there and let it be present. Dumbledore looked at it. He took it by the edge and read it, not quickly, not with the performance of someone reading for the first time. Carefully, as a man reads something he is deciding how to address. He set it down. "This is accurate," he said. "Yes, my father named Sirius Black as trustee," Harry said. "That's his name, in a Gringotts account placed there by James Potter. Yes, you registered your custody of the key on the 3rd of November 1981. Harry kept his voice even, 2 days after Sirius was sent to Azkaban. "Yes," Dumbledore said again. His voice was unchanged, warm, measured, giving nothing by inflection that he had not decided to give. "Why did you hold it personally?" Harry said. "The key. You could have had a ministry solicitor hold it. Why your name specifically?" There was a moment, small, just a slowing of something in Dumbledore's expression. "When your parents died," Dumbledore said, "there was no one in a position to protect your interests. Sirius was in Azkaban. Your mother had no magical family in a position to act. The decision was made to place you somewhere safe, and part of ensuring that you were safe was ensuring that the resources your parents left you were protected from misuse." He paused. "I chose to hold it myself because I wanted to be certain it was held by someone I could trust." "Yourself," Harry said. "Yes." Harry nodded once. He had expected this. He let it settle. "My parents sent me to the Dursleys," he said. "I understand why. Now you've explained the protection. Lily's protection, the blood magic tied to Petunia's house. I've read about it. I understand that was real." He held Dumbledore's gaze. "But the blood protection doesn't explain the key. The key wasn't keeping me safe at Privet Drive. The key is a different thing from the protection. You chose to hold it personally when you didn't need to in order to protect me. I want to know why." The office was very quiet. One of the portraits had stopped pretending to sleep and was watching with visible attention. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment that was longer than his other pauses. When he spoke, his voice had not changed in register or warmth, but it had changed in something underneath those things. "You are right," he said, "that the vault key was not a condition of the blood protection. That is a fair distinction." He looked at the document on the desk. "I made decisions in those first days, decisions made quickly under circumstances that were difficult. I wanted to ensure that Harry Potter's affairs were not accessible to people who might misuse them. I had seen enough, by then, of what the war had done. Keeping custody personally was perhaps more than was necessary. But it was not done with the intention of harm. I didn't say it was, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. I'm not saying you meant to harm me, Harry said. He kept his voice the way he had practiced it, flat and careful, the voice that didn't give anything away before he was ready. I'm saying you made a choice. I want to understand the choice. He paused. Did you know that Sirius Black wasn't given a trial? The silence this time was different. It lasted long enough that Harry counted it. I knew, Dumbledore said. Did you ask for one? I believed, Dumbledore said, and his voice had acquired, for the first time, a quality that was not quite ease, not quite the warmth of a man entirely comfortable in what he was saying, that the evidence was conclusive. Sirius had been named as the Potter's secret keeper. Peter Pettigrew was dead. 12 Muggles were dead. There were witnesses. Did you ask for a trial? Harry said. He kept his voice very level. I'm not asking whether you thought he was guilty. I'm asking whether you asked for a trial. A long silence. Longer than the others. No, Dumbledore said. The word sat on the desk between them, next to the Gringotts document. Harry looked at his hands for a moment, then back up. He was my godfather, he said. My father put his name in a bank account for me. Not a solicitor's name, not an official's name, Sirius's name. That means my father thought, if something happens to us, this is the person who takes care of Harry. He paused. He was supposed to be my family. I know, Dumbledore said. The warmth in his voice was genuine. Harry had no doubt of that. It was not performed, not the warmth of someone deflecting. It was the warmth of a man who genuinely understood what he was being told and found it sorrowful. That was in some ways the hardest part. He was supposed to be my family, Harry said again, and he spent 10 years in Azkaban without a trial, and you knew, and you did not ask. Dumbledore said, I know, Harry. I'm not saying it, so you'll feel it. I'm saying it, so it's been said. The portrait that had been watching made a very small sound. No one acknowledged it. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke in the voice of a man who had arrived at something after a pause in which he had genuinely waded. There were choices made in November of 1981 that I made quickly, in chaos, under the belief that I had sufficient evidence and insufficient time. I chose to believe what I was told. I chose to prioritize securing your safety over investigating what had happened to Sirius. He met Harry's eyes steadily. Those were my choices. I do not offer them as justification. I'm not asking for justification, Harry said. I'm asking you to look into it. He reached into his bag and put the Gringotts document back into the pocket where it lived. He straightened in his chair. I have the account record. I have 2 separate documented sources confirming there was no trial. You've just confirmed it yourself. He kept his voice level. I'm not asking you to say he's innocent. I'm not saying he's innocent. I don't know. But he was my father's choice for my guardian, and he was put in Azkaban without a trial, and if someone with your standing looked into that, it might be possible to at least find out what the truth is. Dumbledore said, I will look into what can be done. Harry nodded. He had expected this too. The offer, the lack of specificity in the offer, the warmth behind the lack of specificity. He had practiced what to do with it. Thank you for seeing me, he said. He stood up and put his bag on his shoulder. He was halfway to the door when Dumbledore said, Harry. He stopped. You have asked, Dumbledore said, the right questions in the right order with more patience than most people twice your age would have managed. I want you to know that I am aware of that. Harry looked at him for a moment. Dumbledore was watching him with that warm, keen attention, and there was something in his eyes that was not quite apology, Not yet, but was in the same neighborhood as it. The look of a man who had seen something he had not expected to see and was still deciding what it meant about him. "Thank you, sir," Harry said. He went out. The corridor was cold and quiet. The gargoyle stepped back into place behind him with a sound of stone on stone. Harry walked to the end of the corridor and stopped at the window. There, the same flat February sky outside, the same dark grounds, and stood for a moment with his hand on the cold stone of the window ledge. He had not expected to feel relieved, because relief was for when something was finished, and this was not finished. Dumbledore had confirmed the document. He had confirmed the no trial. He had said no, quietly, after a silence, to the question of whether he had asked for one. He had not said he was wrong. He had said he would look into what could be done, which was a sentence that contained no commitment. What Harry felt was something else. The weight of knowing that the most powerful man in his world had made a choice in a moment of chaos and grief and had not questioned it, and had moved on, and had continued to move on for 10 years, while Harry grew up in a cupboard under stairs and Sirius Black sat in Azkaban, small golden key in a bank. That weight had been building since August. It was not lighter now, but it had edges now. It had a shape. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the vault key and the folded document and the parchment that still said Dear Sirius at the top, and nothing else. He walked back to Gryffindor Tower. April arrived, and the grounds thawed, and Harry found himself reading differently. This was new. Not the reading itself. He had always read, had read everything he could get his hands on, since Dudley had broken his first library card, and then been given a new one by a librarian who had noticed what was happening, which was one of the small accidental kindnesses Harry filed away as proof that the world was not uniformly indifferent. But the reading was different now. He had spent a year developing the habit of documented questions, of following a line of evidence from its source to its implication without letting assumption fill the gaps. He did not always succeed at this, but he was better at it than he had been in August, and the difference showed up in strange places. The restricted section, for instance, had begun to feel less like a forbidden space and more like an archive with a complicated cataloguing system. He had been in it twice now with Hermione, and once on his own, with permission. For different questions, at different times, he had learned how to frame a request to a librarian in a way that produced access rather than suspicion. He had learned, more slowly, how to read around what he was looking for, that the thing adjacent to the thing you needed was often more useful than the thing itself, which was how he had found his way eventually to Nicholas Flamel. He had known the name since early in the year. It had come up in a way he couldn't pin to a single moment, the way some names accumulated around you before you understood why. He had heard it first from Ron, who had heard something about the Philosopher's Stone in passing, and mentioned it at dinner as a curiosity. He had not thought about it particularly until he began to think about Vault 713. He remembered it clearly, the morning in August when Hagrid had taken him to Gringotts. They had visited Harry's vault first, in the rattling cart, with the goblin teller and the sudden cold of the underground and the stacked gold in the lamplight. But before that, or after, he was less certain of the sequence. Hagrid had gone somewhere else. He had produced a small, grubby package from inside his coat. He had said it was Hogwarts business, Dumbledore's business, and Harry had not asked more. He had not known then what Hagrid had collected. He knew now. The Daily Prophet was archived in the library. Hermione had found this. She found everything. And the issue from the 2nd of August 1991 had a brief item on an interior page about an attempted break-in at Gringotts Wizarding Bank. Vault 713, the item read, had been found empty on investigation following a suspected intrusion, though no perpetrators had been identified. The vault had apparently already been cleared by its owner prior to the event. The same day, Hagrid took Harry to Gringotts. Hagrid also cleared Vault 713 on Dumbledore's orders. The next day, someone broke in and found it empty. Dumbledore had moved whatever was in Vault 713 to Hogwarts. He had moved it the same day he sent Hagrid for Harry. The same trip, the same morning, timed to the hour. Harry had sat with this for some time before he understood what it meant about how Dumbledore fought. The object that had been in Vault 713 was the Philosopher's Stone. He and Hermione and Ron had worked that out over several weeks of careful triangulation. The three-headed dog on the third-floor corridor, the name Nicolas Flamel, a chapter in a library book about alchemical history that mentioned Flamel and the stone in the same paragraph, and Hermione's memory, which had the quality of a card catalogue, producing the relevant passage almost before Harry had finished explaining what he was looking for. Nicolas Flamel, born approximately 1326. Alchemist, believed to be the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone. Still alive, reportedly. Sustained by the elixir of life. The stone was his. It produced the elixir. Without it, he would die. And Dumbledore had it here in the school, behind a set of defenses on the third floor. It was the pattern again. Harry kept seeing it, now that he had seen it once. Dumbledore's method was, find a trusted person, give them a piece of the task, and build layers around the thing being protected so that no single person knew the whole shape of it. Hagrid did not know what was in the package he collected. The defenses on the third floor were assembled from different teachers' work, different obstacles requiring different skills, so that no single person could be the point of failure. Dumbledore sat at the center of all of it without appearing to be at the center of any of it. Harry had been managed the same way. Hagrid, who did not know the details of the vault, McGonagall, who had objected to the Dursleys but followed orders, the Goblins who kept records without asking why. Each person held one piece, acted in good faith, and trusted that Dumbledore's instructions were complete. The system worked by making sure no one person had enough information to question the whole of it. Harry understood this now in his body, not just in his head. He had been the protected object for 10 years. He knew what it felt like to be inside the system with pieces of information given to each person responsible for a part of you, and no one with the full picture, and the person with the full picture very far away and very rarely visible. It did not make him angry at Dumbledore precisely. He had spent the months since February arriving at something more complex than anger. But it made him notice things. What he noticed in April was that the stone was going to be stolen. He had not arrived at this through intuition. He had arrived at it through accumulation. The restricted corridor, the footsteps Ron had heard near the third floor on a night when there was no reason for anyone to be there, the conversation he had overheard by accident between Quirrell and someone Harry had assumed at first was Snape, hissing in a doorway near the library about what lay behind the trap door. They had separated before Harry could make out more, but the direction had been clear enough. Snape had been circling the stone all year. Harry had watched him the way he watched anyone he needed to understand, and he had seen the pattern of it, the interest in the third floor, the way Snape moved around the restricted corridor at odd hours. The conversation in the doorway. The trio had discussed it at length. Hermione had argued the evidence carefully and found it sufficient. Ron had said Snape had probably always been rotten, and they just hadn't had proof until now. Harry had not said what he thought, which was that he was less certain than either of them. But that certain or not, the stone needed to be protected. He was not certain, because he had learned this year that appearances could be managed. He knew that Dumbledore did not show everything. He knew that Quirrell, the slight nervous defense teacher, with his purple turban and his tendency to stammer in crowded corridors, had been behaving strangely for months in ways that were easy to dismiss because he always seemed frightened rather than frightening. Harry had filed the strangeness away without knowing what to do with it. He was not certain, but he was not going to wait for certainty when the alternative was the stone being taken. The decision to go through the trapdoor crystallized on a Tuesday evening in May. When Hermione arrived in the common room with her notes open and her expression carefully level and told them what she had found, that someone had been tampering with the troll on the 5th floor of the defenses, that the evidence of it was visible if you looked at the right places, and that it was likely a matter of days, Ron had said, "Then we go." Hermione had said, "We go." Harry had thought about it for a long moment, thought about the thing he had been thinking about all year, the way Dumbledore built his protections through other people and trusted that the system would hold, the way the system had not always held, and the people inside it did not always know what they were part of. He thought about Hagrid arriving at a ruined cottage because Dumbledore sent him. He thought about the vault key in a pocket for 10 years. He thought about the way a person who was the protected object had no say in how the protection worked and no visibility into its gaps until something fell through one. He did not want to be the protected object. Not again. Not if he could choose. "I'll go," he said. "I want to go." He did not mean it as bravado. He meant it as something harder to put into words, that he had spent 11 years inside someone else's system of protection, moved by someone else's instructions, with pieces of himself held by people who did not know they were holding them, and he had come to understand that the only way to know what the truth was about anything was to go toward it yourself with your own eyes and not wait to be told what to find there. They went over the plan twice. Hermione knew the logic puzzle. She had been working on it quietly for 2 weeks. Ron had memorized the chess configuration on the other side of the Flying Keys room and had views about how the board would have to be played. Harry thought about the dog and the trapdoor and the thing that waited at the end. He put the vault key in his pocket alongside everything else and went to bed. In the morning there would still be classes. They would sit in them and take notes and be first years. But the evening was coming, and Harry intended to be the one who walked toward it. They went at night when the corridor was empty. Harry had the invisibility cloak folded in his bag and the vault key in his pocket, and the particular quality of calm that came he had found when something he had been building toward was finally in motion. The thinking was over. There was only this: the 3rd floor corridor, the door, and on the other side of the door, whatever was going to happen. Hermione had brought a small instrument that produced music. She did not say where she had found it. She opened the door, played the first bars of something simple and slow, and the sound that came from inside the room enormous. 3-throated, a warning from something very large that had been very awake quieted and settled into a low, even breathing, like a cave collapsing slowly into sleep. 3 pairs of eyes closed, 3 enormous heads lowered. They went past the dog quickly and found the trapdoor and dropped through it. Devil's Snare received them. Harry had read about it. Hermione had made them both read about it, with the thoroughness of someone who considered preparedness a form of courtesy to the emergency you were preparing for. He went still the moment the plant touched him, entirely still, the deliberate stillness of someone overriding every instinct, and felt the tendrils loosen in response. Hermione conjured fire, and it retreated. Ron had dropped through just after them, and was already half swallowed. Harry called to him. He relaxed, the plant released him, and they fell through into the chamber below. The Flying Key room was enormous and dark and full of movement. hundreds of keys on wings, beating against the ceiling, filling the air with a noise like very fast shuffling cards. Harry found the broom and mounted it before Ron or Hermione had time to say anything, because this was the part he was made for, and they all knew it. He found the right key, old silver, one wing bent at an angle that matched the lock, in 2 passes of the chamber. He caught it on the 3rd. His hand closed around it mid-flight, and the key struggled once and then was still. The door opened. Wizard's chess, life-size. Ron looked at the board for a long time without speaking. Harry watched him. There was something in Ron's face that was the face of someone doing a specific kind of calculation. Not difficulty, but cost. The expression of a person who has seen what is required and is determining whether they have it. He had it. He directed them to their pieces, and then directed himself to his, and they began to play. Harry had played enough chess with Ron to know that Ron played the way Ron thought, directly, without flourish, already 3 moves ahead of where the board appeared to be. He played the white pieces with the focused economy of someone who had decided this was not about elegance, it was about the path. The black pieces took Ron's knight first, then a bishop, then the knight that Ron had positioned as a decoy on the left flank. Ron watched each one go without expression. When he moved himself to the queen's position, Harry understood what was about to happen. "Ron, it has to be me," he said, it matter-of-factly. "The queen takes the king's knight. That's the only path forward." He looked at Harry directly with the flat certainty of someone who had already finished the argument. "Go, both of you. Don't stop." The black queen's piece moved. Ron went down hard on the stone floor and did not move. Hermione made a sound. Harry looked at Ron for one long moment, still, breathing, alive, 12 next month, currently horizontal on a chessboard in a corridor he was explicitly not supposed to be in. And then he picked up the white king and moved it. Checkmate. The black pieces stepped aside. Harry did not look back. The troll in the next chamber was already unconscious, lying sideways on the stone floor with its club beside it. They stepped around it and kept moving, and then they were at the door with the bottles, and Hermione was already in the potion-reading mode she went into, for problems that had a correct answer in them, moving from bottle to bottle with the quick focus of someone dismantling a lock by feel. She found it. She read it again. She was certain. She put the small bottle in Harry's hand and looked at him. "I'll go back," she said, for Ron. She paused. "You can do this. Has." She said it the way she said things she was certain of, not to encourage him, but because it was true, and stating true things was something she did. "Go," Harry said. He went through the purple flame. The last chamber was not what he had expected, which was that there was nothing in it at first, no one, nothing, just the mirror of Arised, standing alone in the center of the room, like a thing that had been waiting, and the gold of the stone, somewhere inside or behind or within it, and the quality of the air underground that had been still for a long time. He walked toward the mirror. He had heard about it from someone in the common room. A rumor passed along in January about a mirror in a disused classroom where Harry Potter had been found sitting alone. He had thought he understood what it would show him, and had not thought he needed to see it. He stood in front of it. Now the mirror showed him a room that looked like this one, stone and lamplight, and in the room stood 3 people. His mother Thirst. He recognized her from the photographs Hagrid had given him in August. Red hair, green eyes, his eyes exactly, in a face that was not quite his. She was 21. He had memorized this. 21 was the age she had been. She was standing slightly to the left, and she was looking at him. His father, beside her with dark hair like Harry's wearing glasses, and the shape of a face that Harry saw every time he looked in a mirror that was not this one. 21 also. Young in a way that was strange to look at. Young in the way that people who died at 21 would always be young regardless of how old the person looking at them became. And behind them, slightly to the side, a man Harry had never seen before. He was gaunt. That was the first thing, the hollowed quality of his face, the particular thinness of someone who had been somewhere that used a person up. His cheekbones were angular, and the shadows under them were deep, and his hair was dark. He looked like he had been, whoever he had been before, and then something had happened to him that was still ongoing. And this was what that looked like. He was alive. He was standing. He had one hand on James Potter's shoulder in the loose, practiced way of someone who had put their hand there 1,000 times and did not need to think about it. Harry had never seen his face. He had only ever had his name in a ledger, in a bank record, in a letter that said, "Dear Sirius" at the top, and nothing else. He had turned the name over in his head so many times that it had become abstract, a word that meant something he couldn't fully picture. Now the mirror was showing him the picture. Sirius Black looked back at him with grey eyes that were steady even in their exhaustion, and for a moment Harry could not breathe, because this was what had been taken from him. Not just a guardian, not just a name on a vault, a person who stood the way he belonged there, in the same frame as his parents, with his hand on his best friend's shoulder and his eyes on Harry. Family. Complete, Harry stood at the mirror for a long time. He was aware distantly that there was a reason he had come here, and that the reason was not the mirror. He was aware that the stone was somewhere in this equation, behind the glass or in the reflection, or by the mechanism of whatever enchantment Dumbledore had built into this particular defense. He thought about what Hermione had told him once, repeating something she had read, that the stone would be given only to someone who wished to find it, but not to use it. He looked away from the image of Sirius. He looked at his own reflection where it stood in front of his family, and he thought, I don't want it for myself. I want to give it back. I want the chain of custody to be clean. He felt the stone appear in his pocket, cool and solid, exactly the weight of something real. He closed his hand around it. Turn around. The voice was Quirrell's, and it was not the voice Harry had heard in the defense classroom all year, the faint stammer, the air of someone perpetually startled. It was level and cold, and had the quality of something that had been wearing Quirrell for a long time and had gotten tired of the performance. Quirrell stood between Harry and the door. He had his wand out. He looked at Harry with eyes that were flat and assessing in a way no one had ever looked at Harry from inside Quirrell's face before. "The stone," he said. "Give it to me." Harry did not give it to him. What followed was not long. It had the quality of things that happen very fast and are remembered afterward in pieces that don't quite connect. Quirrell's hand reaching for Harry's collar, the sudden burning where the hand made contact, Quirrell recoiling. Genuinely recoiling, not a dodge, but a flinch of real pain. He looked at his own hand with an expression Harry had not expected to see. Surprise. Harry grabbed his face. The sound Quirrell made was not something Harry could have described afterward. The burning went both ways. Harry felt it too, a searing pain that ran up his arms and behind his eyes. But Quirrell went down. He went down the way things go down when something essential has given out. Not a fall, but a collapse. And then the turban came loose, and Harry saw the thing on the back of his head, and understood that whatever Quirrell had been this year, the name for what Harry was looking at now was older and worse. The face on the back of Quirrell's head opened its mouth. The wraith came out of it like a cold wind that had a direction, passing through Harry in a way that had no physical sensation at all, only the impression of something immense and hateful moving through him and not finding purchase. And then it was gone, and Harry was on his knees on the stone floor. The stone was still in his hand. He closed his eyes. He was still holding it when the dark came. He woke to the smell of something antiseptic and the sound of Ron eating. This was familiar enough to be reassuring. Ron ate at every available opportunity, regardless of circumstances, which Harry had come to understand as a form of continuity. The hospital wing was white and still and bright with the particular brightness of June, which was different from the brightness of any other month, and Harry lay in the bed for a moment just registering that he was in it, alive, horizontal, with both his hands. "Morning," Ron said from the adjacent bed. He had a large box of something on his lap that someone had clearly sent. "Morning," Harry said. The stone was secured. He knew this before he remembered anything else clearly. It arrived as a fact, already settled. He had given it to Dumbledore. He had woken up briefly at some point in the night to find Dumbledore standing over him with the stone in his own hand, looking at Harry with an expression that was equal parts relief and something more complicated. And Harry had managed, "Flamel gets it back," before going under again. He did not know whether that had been a real moment or a dream, but the stone was not in his pocket, which meant it had happened. Hermione arrived mid-morning with a stack of books, and what Harry suspected was every get-well card the Gryffindor Common Room had produced in the last 48 hours. She set the books on his bedside table and sat in the chair that had clearly already been there some time, and gave Harry the look she gave him when she had done her assessment of a situation. And the situation was acceptable. "You were out for 2 days," she said. "I know. Ron was out for 1. She glanced at Ron. He woke up and immediately asked for food. "I was hungry," Ron said, without apparent concern for how this reflected on him. They sat in the hospital wing in the easy quiet of people who had been through something real together and were now on the other side of it and did not need to discuss it immediately. Madame Pomfrey moved through the room with her characteristic quality of disapproval for all patients, on the grounds that they had clearly done something to deserve being in her hospital wing. Harry ate what she brought him. It was better than rock cakes. The end of term came in the way. Ends of term came, all at once and then slower. A week of exams followed by a week of waiting, and then the noise of the whole school, remembering that it had a social existence, and deploying it all at once. The Gryffindor Common Room was loud every evening, and the grounds were full during the days, and the lake had the quality of summer on it, flat and bright in the afternoon light, the giant squid visible once near the surface before it lost interest and descended. Gryffindor won the House Cup. Harry was there when the points were announced, and the cheering around him was real and warm, and he was genuinely pleased in the way he was pleased by things that were good and deserved celebrating. But the part of him that had been building a question since February was still waiting for the Dumbledore conversation he knew was coming. It came on a Tuesday, 5 days before the end of term. The door of the hospital wing opened, and Dumbledore came in with the easy authority of a man who went where he needed to go and was not in the habit of asking whether this was convenient for the room. He had his usual expression, the attentive warmth, the half-moon spectacles, the sense of someone who was bringing his full attention to this particular moment. He settled into the chair beside Harry's bed and began to say something about the stone. "I want to ask you about Sirius Black again," Harry said. Dumbledore stopped. He looked at Harry for a moment with that alert, blue-eyed attention. Then something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, Not the expression of a man who had been caught at something, but the expression of a man who had known a question was coming and found it arriving sooner than he had prepared for. "Very well," he said. Harry sat up in the bed and looked at him directly. "You told me in February that you would look into what could be done. I want to know what that means, whether it's actually going to happen." He paused. "You're the chief warlock of the Wizengamot, aren't you?" It was not entirely a question. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality it had acquired in February during the harder parts of that conversation, the same warmth, but with something underneath it that was not ease. "I believed Sirius guilty," he said in 1981. "I believed the evidence was clear and the case was closed, and I moved on." He met Harry's eyes steadily. "I was wrong not to demand a trial. That is the plainest I can put it. Whatever I believed about his guilt, he was entitled to stand before the Wizengamot and answer the case against him, and he was not given that, and I had standing to ask for it, and I did not. The hospital wing was very quiet." Harry had imagined this moment many times since February, imagined what it would feel like to hear someone of authority say the word wrong in relation to what had been done to Sirius. He had expected something. Relief, perhaps, or the particular satisfaction of a question that had finally found its answer. What he found instead was something quieter and more complicated, the feeling of a weight that had not been removed, but had been acknowledged, which was not the same thing as being put down. "I want you to ask for a formal review," Harry said, "not a pardon. I'm not asking you to say he's innocent. I don't know whether he's innocent. I don't have enough to know that." He kept his voice level. "I'm asking for the trial he should have had in 1981, the evidence reviewed, the case heard. Whatever the outcome is." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "I will think carefully about what can be done," he said. "That's not a yes," Harry said. "No," Dumbledore said. "It is not." The space between them held this. "But I will think carefully," Dumbledore said, "which is more than I did in November of 1981, and I want you to know that I am aware of the difference." Harry looked at him. Dumbledore looked back with those bright, tired, ancient eyes, and Harry thought, this is a man who has been told something true and is sitting with it. He is not going to leap up and fix it this afternoon. He may not fix it at all, but he is sitting with it. "All right," Harry said. Dumbledore stayed a while longer. They talked about the stone, that it was being returned to its owner, that Nicholas Flamel and his wife had made their peace with what would follow, that some things ended when their time was finished. Harry listened and understood that this, too, was being offered as something relevant, though he did not say so. When Dumbledore left, Harry sat for a long time, looking at the window. The Hogwarts Express back to London was crowded and warm, and smelled of the food from the trolley and the particular combination of trunks and owls and 11 months of school. Harry shared a compartment with Ron and Hermione, and ate a great deal of things that were orange and made no apology for this, and they talked about summer and what they would do and what it would be like to come back in September, and the talk was real and easy, and Harry was inside it. He was also inside the other thing. Still, the thing that did not stop because term ended. He thought about Sirius. He thought about what it meant to be in Azkaban in June, whether June looked different there, whether the seasons reached it at all. He thought about the mirror's image, those grey eyes, that hollowed face, the steady quality of someone who had survived something without being finished by it. He did not know whether Sirius was innocent. He had the vault record, and the no-trial fact, and Hagrid's account of a man who came back to the ruins. He did not have enough for certainty, but he had enough for the question. At King's Cross, the platform was loud with families. He spotted the Weasleys before Ron did, the brightness of them, the sheer number, the red that was visible from a distance. Molly Weasley was already moving before Harry had fully come through the barrier, and she folded him into a hug that was uncomplicated and complete, the hug of a woman who had decided to include him in something. He did not object. He stood in the middle of King's Cross Station, in the hug of a woman he had known for 10 months, and for a moment he just let himself be there. When she released him, Arthur was saying something about Muggle things, and Ron was being collected by Fred and George simultaneously, and Ginny was watching Harry with the careful expression of someone practicing composure. Harry smiled at her, and she smiled back and looked away. He put his hand in his pocket. The vault key was there. It had been there since August. Since the moment the goblin teller had read from the ledger and the morning had changed. He had carried it through September and October and all the rest of it, through the Gringotts document, and the No trial, and Hagrid's hut, and the potions classroom, and the headmaster's office, and the last corridor. He had carried it through the mirror. He held it in his hand inside his pocket and felt the weight of it, small and specific, and thought about James Potter walking into a bank on a day he had probably assumed was ordinary and writing a name into an account because he trusted that person above anyone else with the thing he cared about most. He did not know what would happen next. He did not know whether Dumbledore would ask for a trial, or whether the Wizengamot would hear it, or whether the evidence would be enough when it was finally examined. He did not know what Sirius was. After 10 years in Azkaban, he did not know if the person in the mirror still existed in the one who was there. He had a document, and an admission and a key that had been in someone else's pocket for 10 years before it was in his. He had asked the right question at the beginning of it. He had not stopped asking since. That was more than he had in August. It was not enough, but it was a beginning, and beginnings he had come to understand were the part